Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another Survivor Top 10. This time, continuing on with my top 10s based around certain points in Survivor history. Now, in the past I've already done one for before Survivor All-Stars, and here I'm going to do one for my top 10 players immediately after Survivor Micronesia. Now, this was a pretty interesting list to put together here. Namely because, this video was initially concepted as before heroes versus villains. However, I kind of realized that by the time of Survivor Micronesia, just so much of my top 10 had already changed by that point in Survivor history, to the point where there's very little connective tissue between the two lists. So with that, I decided here we're going to actually stop down and do a video here about my top 10 players initially after Micronesia, and I will still do a video based around Heroes vs. Villains. However, I think I'm going to do that one after Heroes vs. Villains instead of before. That way we can add in the context of Heroes vs. Villains, and then obviously also Samoa and Tocantins, which also have players that will probably make the list as well. But first I want to talk about the people that didn't make the list. I guess honorable mentions for these first few people. These are essentially the people that aren't on the list anymore. People that were on the list last time for my before All-Stars video that aren't on there now after Micronesia. So you have someone like a Vecepia, which again, to me, I always had flaws with Vecepia's game and her overall game philosophy. So again, for me, not that big of a surprise that she's not on the list at this point with another 9 seasons worth of players. So again, not a big surprise there. Brian Heidick is off the list, which is kind of a weird one because, again, spoiler alert for that list, he was number 1. But I do feel like even by this point in Survivor history, my opinion on Brian Heidick would have dropped significantly, because I do think something that really props him up before All-Stars is the fact that he is like the sole dominant winner of the show up until that point. However, at this point in Survivor history, we've seen so many people have pretty dominant performances on the show, to which it minimizes Brian's overall legacy there. And then also just Brian is a player that I do have holes with his game, and because of that, I do feel like it was enough to knock him off the list. I also have some people that did also appear on All-Stars, which would have been after the events of the list I previously talked about. So you have someone like Atina, who, to be fair, All-Stars doesn't really harm her as a player in my eyes. Again, she just had no real chance coming into All-Stars. But again, overall, her game philosophy is definitely one that doesn't quite match up to the top 10 by this point in Survivor history. Rob Cesternino is someone that I was relatively close to making the list here. He was only like a few spots off. And while All-Stars wasn't a great performance for him, I will say again, it didn't really greatly affect how I look at him as a player, but still didn't quite make the list. Then we got Richard Hatch, who again, he was barely on the first list, so not surprised that he's not on a list after 9 more seasons, but again, didn't make the cut. Colby Donaldson, not really much to boon his legacy from All-Stars, and was someone that wasn't super high on the list to begin with, so didn't make it on here. We have Lex, who, while his All-Star run is very rocky, I will say that my opinion of him as a player probably goes up after All-Stars, considering he shows that he can be a pretty dominant figure on his tribes across 2 seasons at that point. But again, he was barely on the list the first time around. That All-Stars is really just like a slight bump for him to me, to where not enough to make the list at this point in Survivor history. We also have Kathy Vavrick O'Brien, who for me is probably the person that has the biggest jump up out of the people that were on All-Stars that were on my initial list. I do feel like after All-Stars, my opinion of Kathy would have gone up quite a bit, considering she's, again, at that point had 2 pretty strong runs, while her second run ended with disaster there. The fact that she was so well insulated before the merge, I think, is something that is pretty impressive. But again, at this point in Survivor history, I just feel like there's so many other players I would find more impressive. So she's not on the list. And the last player from my original list that's not on there now is someone that played on Survivor Micronesia, and that is Johnny Fairplay. And again, his appearance on Micronesia doesn't harm my overall look at him as a player. If not, actually probably boons it, considering how, if he wasn't off his pain meds and didn't end up quitting the game, he essentially would have been in a pretty solid spot in the game, which is very impressive for Johnny Fairplay coming into that season. But again, for me, not enough to make the top 10. And now let's get into the actual honorable mentions, people that weren't on my initial list but would have been in consideration now. I think first up, we're actually having someone from All-Stars. We have Big Tom, who again, to me, Big Tom through All-Stars, while he didn't play the greatest across All-Stars, again, showed that he can be a very consistent player. He gets 5th place 2 times in Survivor history. I believe at that point in Survivor history has the most days played in Survivor history. Like, that's impressive in its own right. But again, to me, I just don't think he is an overtly impressive player to me to quite make the top 10. And moving on to the seasons that we haven't talked about yet, from Survivor Vanuatu, I would have considered Julie Berry, who, again, not really that close to making the list, but definitely someone I would have greatly considered. I do think Julie was one of the better players from Vanuatu, but when we have another person in a very similar archetype that is very clearly ahead of her, it definitely doesn't incentivize me to put Julie that much higher. Also from Vanuatu, I did consider Twyla, who, I think did some very impressive maneuvering through the game through Vanuatu, but also was a pretty reviled figure on her season. And I just can't imagine her ever winning a jury vote. And because that was inconsistent enough to put her on the list. From Palau, I did consider Ian, and Ian was number 11 on the list to me. It was between him and the number 10 person, obviously, and the number 10 person to me has a bigger resume than Ian, especially because we kind of see Ian kind of crumble by the end of his season. While I do think he does very good work for the majority of his season, I do think the way that Katie and Tom kind of manipulate him at the end of the season, cause him to break down, is enough for him to not quite make the top 10. From Guatemala, I would have very much considered Rafe, who again, to me is in a very similar sort of tier to an Ian in terms of their overall ability as a player. Ian is probably more blatantly an all-around solid player. But again, Rafe is right there to me too. I think the problem with Rafe is that I do think he makes some emotional decisions at points. But again, a very solid player, but just didn't quite make the top 10. Next up, a player technically from Palau, but the reason they're on an honorable mention is because of Guatemala, and that is Stephanie LaGrossa, who again, I don't think played either of her games particularly well. But again, she has shown that she is a consistent player. She was able to get through all of Oolong on her original season, and it made it to the final 202nd season. Again, at this point in Survivor history, I think Stephanie is a very consistent player. But again, I just think her overall game is very faulty, and she doesn't make the top 10. Also consider Danny, obviously the winner of Guatemala, who was in contention. However, I do think the problem with Danny is that so much of her game is just kind of unknown. And also for me, I would just say Rafe is probably a better all-around player than Danny, so she didn't quite make the list. From Survivor Panama, I did consider Aris, mainly because he's just a winner from this era of the show. To be honest, he wasn't that close to making it on, because again, I don't think he played that great of a game. While he is someone that could be an overall well-rounded player, I do feel there's so many holes in his initial game that do leave him off of the top 10. And finally, we have a couple people that were returnees on Micronesia that I do want to talk about at least. So we got Ozzy, who again, I've never been too high on Ozzy as a player. However, I do think at the time of Survivor Micronesia, we obviously saw one season of him getting pretty much to the end, in a point where he pretty much wins the season had it not been for Yul making a deal with Adam on his way out. And there he demonstrates to be a very strong physical competitor. And then on Micronesia, while he wasn't as physically dominant there, he does become a massive figurehead for his alliance for a majority of the game and had a level of control throughout the entirety of the game. So again, I think there's enough there to have him as honorable mention, but again, not quite close enough to make the top 10. And the other person we'll be talking about is Yao. And Yao Man's always been an interesting player to me, with him being one of the better strategic thinkers at this point in Survivor history, and with him also being kind of endearing enough to be good enough socially, and also being surprisingly solid in challenges. But I still probably would have looked at Yao as a pretty inconsistent player at this point, especially after we had just saw Micronesia, which again, to me, he's kind of grouped in for the Rob Sesterninos of the world in terms of his overall game ability, which also, again, didn't quite put him on the list. But there we go. That is my honorable mentions. Now let's get into the top 10. At number 10 is actually the only person to carry over from the previous list. And at number 10, we do have Ethan ZOHN. And Ethan is still on the list, mainly because I actually look at All-Stars as an appearance that boons his overall ability as a player. We did see him on Africa, and again, my respect for Ethan as a player in Africa has gone up over time. While I do think the actual game he plays is lacking at points, I do think he demonstrates a lot of game ability over the course of that season. And to me, All-Stars really just cements that. I mean, we see him play in a completely opposite position, him now being on the bottom. And I do think he plays pretty well from that situation, really getting screwed over by the fact that he is a former winner, and because that they're not really willing to give him any real leverage in the game. But he does do a good job at squeaking by round after round after round, despite being on the bottom the entire time. And to me, that alone is pretty impressive in terms of showing him as a well-rounded player. And to me, that is what bumped him above like someone like an Ian, where we see Ian kind of crumble when he faces adversity at points, while we never really see that with Ethan. While Ethan technically remained strong the entire way through, and again, that overall just boosted my opinion of him as a player, so he's here at number 10. Now number 9 is actually the last pre-All-Stars player on the list somehow already. But this was someone that wasn't on the list last time, but after All-Stars would have been on the list. And at number 9, we do have Boston Rob. And Boston Rob's a tough one to assess here because, like, obviously he's a non-winner at this point in the show. And also his All-Star game is faulty, especially with how he manages people like Alex and a Big Tom on the way out. But I still think Boston Rob plays an incredible game on Survivor All-Stars that really would have boosted my opinion of his overall game ability to where, like, I'm a bit unsure exactly if I would have had him at number 1 after All-Stars. I think I probably would have gone for Ethan post All-Stars, as again, to me, like, it would feel weird to have a non-winner as the number 1 player of all time, especially after that many seasons. However, when it's Rob and Ethan fighting for spots number 9 and 10, I do feel like I was more impressed with what Boston Rob was able to do on All-Stars than what Ethan was able to do in either of his appearances. And Boston Rob is, again, another one of these players that we've seen play from the bottom as well. And again, while he did have some faulty moments while playing on the bottom on Marquesas, I do still think it's impressive that he was able to take away the power from Hunter and flip the game on him, and was able to remain safe through the Gabe vote, despite being a very clear target at that point in the season. And again, his All-Star season is such an impressive feat to me, one of the most dominant games ever played in the history of the show, with him still having a chance of winning at the end if he ends up getting to the end with Jenna. So for me at this point, it's enough to land him here at number 9. Now number 8, and again, from this point forward, every other player played for their first time after Survivor All-Stars, which is kind of insane how much, again, like how much this list changes across 9 seasons. But at number 8, we do have the only player from Survivor Vanuatu on the list. We do have Chris Daugherty. I'll be honest, actually, Chris is actually lower on this list than a certain other player that I put him higher than on my player winner ranking that I did previously. And a large part of that is because, again, like I did kind of swap on these two players to where I do feel like I have Chris lower as a player looking back on it now, or again, like I do feel like Chris definitely is someone that I could see being a relatively early boot on any given season. Like, while he wasn't here on Vanuatu, he still got 4 votes, and he is one of the only players in the history of Survivor to win the game after getting votes at their first tribal. And again, a 5-4 vote is very close. Like, while he did have those 5 votes on his side locked in, like, that is still a scary spot to be in for someone like Chris here. And considering this is when he was in, like, better shape than what he would later be in, I feel like that's kind of a worrying prospect of that he was even barely surviving the round during Survivor Vanuatu. So I just don't know how consistent of a player he would have been at this point in Survivor history. However, again, obviously there are impressive elements of his game. Through the course of one season, was able to show that he can play from both the top and the bottom. Mind you, I do think he does have some faulty decision making at points while playing at the top, in putting all of his trust in to Twyla and Julie, which, I mean, to be fair, he had more reason to than someone like a Sarge or someone like a Chad, but it still ends up causing him to be at the bottom at the merge. But also, to be fair, by that point, he was probably screwed anyway, considering I think John Kenny probably would have flipped also. But again, the way he navigates through the end game is very impressive. I mean, while he isn't the one to create the plan to flip the vote on Leanne, he is part of the execution of it, with him getting Eliza on board. He creates a final 2 deal with Twyla. Twyla decides to honor over her initial final 2 with Scout. I do think he has some wonky jury management at points, particularly with Eliza and Julie, with him continuously lying to him, even at points where it doesn't make sense for him to do so. But again, he really ends up rectifying that by his final trial performance, where he clearly gets them back on his side. So again, like, it's a topsy-turvy game, a game that does have a lot of holes in my opinion, but also one that has a lot of pros as well. So Chris lands here number 8. Now number 7, moving on to the first player on the list that had played in Survivor Micronesia. And here we do have Amanda. And again, this is an interesting point in Survivor history for Amanda because she's literally coming off of 2 back-to-back seasons as a finalist. And that is very impressive. Again, she's the only person in Survivor history at this point to be able to make it to Final Tribal twice. And while, yeah, she does have a bad Final Tribal performance in both of her seasons, I do think most of her game up until that point is very, very strong, with China's in particular being a pretty impressive performance. I feel like at this point in Survivor history, I would have looked at her as one of the more consistent players in the history of the show, and her being someone that I would look at someone that would always make it far into any given season. And considering she also feels like a very well-rounded player, with her being competent strategically, her being competent socially, and her being, again, solid physically as well, like she does seem like a very well-rounded player, to where despite the holes in her game, in the sense that she struggles with winning a final jury vote and does come off as a bit naive to a lot of the cast, I do feel like her consistency in the game at this point in Survivor history is something to be lauded. So because of that, she does land here at number 7. Now number 6, moving on to a player that, again, also played in Micronesia and someone that I would have been high on at this point in Survivor history, but didn't quite reach the upper echelon. And at number 6, we do have CIRIE. Micronesia, to me, is CIRIE's obviously best game. It is the season that she is the closest to winning. And while, again, like I don't think either of her next 2 appearances are as impressive to me as her appearance on Micronesia, I will say that those 2 appearances did boon my opinion of CIRIE's game. I do think this continued legacy of her being screwed over in Survivor history, where, again, like she has a more legitimate downfall in Panama, but even then, I mean, that's a situation where she has to go into fire due to Terry having the idol that's able to be used at 4. And in Micronesia, she's obviously voted out because of the medevac causing a final 2. She does get screwed over there, but I do think the continued legacy of her getting screwed over in Here's Villains due to an idol play, and then again in Game Changers due to Advantage Geddon, I feel like that overall adds to her legacy season after season. That would continue to bump her up in my overall estimations as time would go on. While like I feel like here of Micronesia, again, like obviously she played probably her 2 better games at this point in Survivor history, which is enough to land her in the top 10 here. But I do feel like with only 2 seasons here, I would still have a level of hesitancy in terms of her overall consistency in the game, where I feel like if I were to see CIRIE again, I would probably expect her to be a relatively early boot. And to be fair, we technically do see that in Heroes or Villains, but again, it ends up being kind of a fluky boot, to which that ends up booning her overall reputation to me. So again, at this point in Survivor history, I would have been very high on CIRIE, obviously. We've had already 2 very impressive runs. However, I feel like her legacy continues to bolster every time she plays, to where at this point, she isn't quite in the conversation to me of being the best of the best. Especially because I also feel like at this point in Survivor history, it was also a bit wonky on if CIRIE would have even won if she got to the end, as I do feel like it was more of a common assumption to think that PARVATI was going to win until the last few years, where we do get a bit more confirmation on CIRIE's endgame chances. But again, to me, like I do have CIRIE very highly ranked, but not quite enough to land her in the top 5 at this point in Survivor history, especially considering every other person from this point forward is a winner, which I do think plays a factor into it. And because that, CIRIE lands here at number 6. Now, number 5, again, the remaining list are all winners of the show. And at number 5 is the person that I mentioned earlier that I bumped above Chris based on the last time I ranked them as players. And that person is TODD. Now, I still have the same issues with TODD as I had in my player winner ranking. I do feel like there's still a lack of clarity on TODD's game for me, in the sense that we don't know exactly how he plays from the bottom. I mean, TODD was someone that was in a dominant position the entire time he played the game and never really faced any true adversity. And because I do feel like it's a bit of a question mark to me how he would play when things aren't going his way. Things that we obviously did see from Chris. However, again, like I just feel like there are bigger holes in Chris's game than TODD. And to be fair, also with TODD, there's another person that we will be talking about later on that I have a similar sort of stance on, and that person's way higher on the list. But to be fair, I also feel like that person also had a more clear-cut win than TODD, where, again, TODD is someone that, while he does do impressive work in convincing the jury to vote for him at Final Tribal, I do very much feel like he had to do that at Final Tribal. Like, I do think before Final Tribal, TODD's win was definitely not secure, where I do think it was much more up in the air between him and Amanda. And while I do think he eventually is able to secure that win, I think the fact that he had to do it at Final Tribal is a bit of a knock to me, considering I don't know if he'll be able to do that on any given appearance. However, I do feel like he also deserves some special credit at this point in Survivor history for being one of the more more strategically aggressive players in history to show up until this point. I mean, he is one of the first like true super fans to win the show. However, again, like I don't know how he plays as an underdog. That's part of an issue for me. I also don't feel like he was a clear-cut winner by the time he got to the end, which is also an issue for me. And I do feel like there were certain people that were upset at Todd and didn't want to vote for him, which is also an issue for me. So again, there's minor nitpicks here and there for me with Todd that land him here at number 5. Now number 4. At number 4, we're moving on to a player that I've always been very mixed on, and like I really just don't know where to land this person because I have been low on him in the past. I decided to go up on him a bit when I did the player winner ranking, and since then I've gone back down. But I do think at this point in Survivor history, immediately after Survivor Micronesia, I would have had him at number 4, and that is Tom Westman. Now, I just don't know how to truly contextualize Tom's win. And a lot of this comes from me not really being able to fully grasp Tom as a player. Like, obviously, I think on paper, Tom is a very well-rounded player, being one of the better physical competitors in the history of the show, being one of the more strategically active winners in the show at this point, clearly having a killer instinct, and also being solid enough socially. I do think he has some holes there in the sense that some people did look at him as misogynistic, but again, still overall a solid performance on Palau. However, I think at the same time, I do have a tough time reconciling just how Tom was actually perceived on the show, because I feel like the show makes you think that, oh, he was this big hero, everyone loved him, when I feel like that's very clearly not the case from watching the footage. Like, while they did have a level of respect for him, especially by the end, especially against Katie, and he probably would have won against almost everyone there, I do feel like there is also a large element of him being looked at as a figurehead, more so than him actually being this like leader figure for his tribe. And while I do think he's able to flip that on its head at the final 6, where he does take out Greg, who I think is one of those people who did look at him as more of a figurehead, he then is also immediately turned on by Ian as well. And like, to me, like, I just very much feel like Tom was more so this person that everyone was kind of dragging along as someone to be like a meat shield for them, only for them to miss their opportunity of actually taking him out and for him to like win every immunity to get to the end. Anyway, like, that's kind of the way I do look at Tom's game at this point. But again, at this point in Survivor history, he's still shown himself to be a very solid all-around player. Even at the point where he faces adversity and him knowing that Greg is coming for him, he's able to instantly flip the votes against him, utilizing Ian to flip over Katie. Again, he's shown himself to be a pretty solid player all around here. But considering just how much he had to bank on competitions on Palau, a season that greatly benefited him, is a bit of a worry to me in terms of his overall consistency moving forward. So because that, again, for me, he would land here number 4. Now number 3, we're moving on to a player that would have gotten a massive boost from Survivor Micronesia, the final person from Survivor Micronesia here, and that is obviously the winner in Parvati. Now Parvati at 3 here is a bit interesting because obviously Parvati played a very strong game of Micronesia, one again I do have issues with. Again, the fact that she was trying to go to the CIRIE, the fact that she was in potential danger in the first round. Again, not ideal, but also still a very strong game, one where she does create the power structure that ends up dominating the game. So obviously that is the season that truly bumps her up to number 3 here. However, I will say her Cook Islands game is also relatively strong. Like, while she does play less aggressively over the course of that season, she was someone that was so well positioned throughout the entire season, and it really took for the I-2-4 to take control of the game, something that seemed very unlikely for her to end up being booted before the end, where before that she was primed to be the eventual winner, where she was in this very solid alliance with Adam, Candace, and Nate, with all of them wanting to take her to the end in a position where she's the most playable option on the jury out of those people. So again, like, I do think at this point, her Cook Islands game definitely would have boosted her here as well, where I think if it wasn't for her Cook Islands game, I don't know if Parvati from Micronesia is this high on the list to me. Where I think if we just take Micronesia on face value, like, she's probably around where CIRIE and Amanda are, to be honest, if not possibly even lower. But I do, again, look at her Cook Islands game as a pretty impressive one, considering she didn't really know what she was doing, and because I feel like I would have a lot of faith in Parvati on any random season of the show, despite some slight inconsistency with her being targeted right at the beginning here of Micronesia. But again, I feel like I would have had a decent amount of faith in her. But again, I still feel like there are holes in her game, and enough holes to the point where I don't have her above the next 2. especially when she does have like poor jury management with people like an Eliza and a James and an Ozzy, to the point where she's never getting like Ozzy or James's votes in pretty much any situation. I think that's pretty poor play as well. But again, I do think she is a pretty solid player at this point in Survivor history. So here, number 3. Now, number 2, we have the player that initially beat Parvati, and there we have Yul. And Yul is still a tough one to assess at this point, largely because, again, like obviously his game is very much dictated by him having the idol that allows him to pretty much skate all the way to the final 3 at the point that he's able to get the majority at the merge. But again, he was able to get the majority at the merge in a situation where he came in down in numbers. He's able to flip Penner over through the use of his idol. Really impressive work there. And really, I think that sums up Yul as a player. I think Yul is probably the best strategic thinker in the history of the show up until this point. I think the way he's able to utilize the idol is very impressive. And while it is, like, again, kind of a knock in terms of his winning game to me, I do think it's a very impressive element of him as a player, where it shows how versatile of a player he is and how he is able to take advantage of all these opportunities that are handed to him. Again, he barely wins a jury vote, which I think is a bit of an issue. But again, it also leads to another pro of his, again, in the fact that he's able to make this deal with Adam to eventually vote for him, which is an impressive element of his game to me. And I think in that metric also, he was kind of harmed by the fact that he'd even meet like someone like a Rebecca and barely had time with like a Jenny, who were people that were on the jury. Like, to me, in this point in Survivor history, I would have thought of Yul as a pretty solid all-around player. Like, while I do think socially there probably isn't as much to chew on as there is with obviously a strategic game, I do think physically, like, again, he was always coming in second to Ozzy in most of the challenges, which is impressive in its own right. I do think he would have been primed to do pretty well in any given season around this point in Survivor history. And again, to me, like, I just would have had a lot of faith in him. And again, considering the person right below him on the list is Parvati, someone that he simply outclasses in Cook Islands, to me, he had to be above her. So he's here at number 2. Now, number 1, the best player to me immediately after Survivor Micronesia is Earl Cole from Survivor Fiji. Now, as I mentioned before with Todd, I do have a similar issue with Earl here in terms of the fact that I don't think he faces as much adversity as I would like to see from someone that I'm going to have as like my definitive number 1 pick. But I do feel like Earl plays a near perfect game on Fiji. Again, it is an incredible game of him being in the center of all the power structures throughout the game. Again, he is in a very good spot on the original Ravu tribe, never really in danger there, and really only gets a single vote from Rita because she knows that he's going to be safe. Now, a level of adversity I think you can say for him is that he does come into swap technically down in numbers. Now, I do know that there was the builders versus explorers element of things from the beginning of the game that did greatly boon him by the time the swap that allowed him to rebuild his alliance with someone like a Boo and a Stacy and a Cassandra. And also you do have the Black Alliance that I feel like I didn't even really know about until a lot more recently, but the Black players did make an agreement to work together on Survivor Fiji, and that also, I think, booned his overall potential in this game. But again, I feel like he takes advantage of those situations and does so pretty masterfully there, where it allows him to really just control the rest of the game. With the only point him not being in on the vote was during the Yao vote, but even then, there was no inclination that they were ever going to target Earl in that situation, with Dreams and Cassandra both still wanting to take Earl to the end, despite the fact that Earl was the biggest jury threat in the game, to where it's even been talked about that he probably beats Yao based on how the jury was thinking on the island. Again, for me, it was a very impressive individual game. The question for me was, should it be number 1 on the player ranking at this point? And I decided to go with it largely because, like, one, a lot of this was just natural game ability. I mean, this was just Earl not knowing the game at all and coming into it and just naturally picking it up like that, which I think is something that is very impressive about Earl as a player here, is just how naturally suited he is for the game of Survivor. I also feel like, again, he was a very solid social player, very solid strategic player, and probably not on like the Yul or Todd levels just from a strict strategy standpoint. But I think out of the winners, I think he's probably 3rd in that aspect at this point in this show. I mean, he was like pretty much a master at positioning, where again, there was never a point where he was ever in danger the entire way. I think he is a pretty flawless player at this point in Survivor history, with the only real flaw being the fact that there is a bit of a lack of information on how exactly he would play from the bottom. But considering how impressive everything else he did was, I feel like at this point in Survivor history, I would have been okay with having him as the top player up to this point, so because he's obviously here at number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my top 10 players after Survivor in Micronesia. Now, as I said before, I do plan on doing one for also after Heroes vs. Villains, as I do feel like there are a lot of players from Heroes vs. Villains that their placements would change, and then also you got to add in certain notable figures from Tocantins and Samoa. That would make that a pretty different list as well. And beyond that, I think I'll probably do one more in this series, probably one based around Survivor Cambodia, as I feel like that's really the only other milestone that really matters in terms of the changing of the top 10 players, outside of obviously Winners at War, which I've already done a video technically about. So stay tuned for those down the road. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.